Welcome and thank you for being part of WorkSafe's webinar series for Health and Safety Month. My name is Rob Kelly. I'm the Director of Specialist Services and I'll be your host for today's webinar. While our program of sessions are virtual this year, our aims for Health and Safety Month remain the same, and that's to keep you up to date. And the theme this year is you learn something new every day. This webinar today is actually the second in the series of Why WorkSafe Exists, and it's a case study of prosecutions. If you joined our last session, we spoke to two inspirational workers who suffered devastating workplace injuries and went on to manage their return to work with grace, determination, and thankfully success. The session today will examine the most serious cases where employers haven't met their duty and obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. We have 3 case studies to go through, and we'll explain how they've gone through an investigation and in 2 cases led to successful prosecutions and changes to work practices. So our speaker today is Mark Glenister, and Mark is a former police officer who thought he saw it all. Mark is now, after being an investigator himself in WorkSafe, he's now the manager of WorkSafe's Fatalities Investigations team. Good morning, Mark, and welcome.
Morning, Rob. Morning, everyone.
Before we get into it, I just want to set the scene for the important work you do and why it's important, and share some sobering statistics from last year. So in 2020, we saw 67 workplace deaths in Victoria. And of those, we investigated 55, and the remaining are still ongoing. And within that, the toll includes 29 workers who died in a work-related incident, and 20 workers who died in work-related road incidents. And then we go into further 13 workers who died of the effects of disease that they contracted as part of their work, and 1 worker who died in work-related medical incident, and finally 1 worker who died from work-related suicide. Now, some of those terms are fairly new because in July this year, 2021, the criteria for defining workplace fatalities was changed and broadened to include things like transport incidents, disease, criminal, medical, or suicide incidents. The majority of industries, or the major industries that are covered off in fatalities, are transport, agriculture, manufacturing, construction, and public sector workers. And if you're a male between the ages of 55 and 64, you're the most represented group. So Mark, welcome. To your observations, you're probably seeing more serious incidents of fatalities than most in WorkSafe. And the first case study we're going to get into is about a skylight. Can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, this was an incident that occurred at a high-rise apartment block a few years ago in Melbourne, and it was unusual in that the immediate risk wasn't obvious, I suppose, to the workers who turned up, albeit the risks associated with skylights are generally fairly well known, and even, I suppose, to myself, when I turned up, when we'd been told that there was a fall from height that had resulted in a serious injury, it wasn't immediately apparent to me what had actually occurred. But if you look at the first photo that we've got prepared here, you'll see it looks like I suppose at face value, a reasonably safe work site, but anyone with any knowledge, I suppose, in the construction industry would understand the dangers posed by voids. And we see a couple of skylights there, those domed white structures that are on the roof, and those skylights led to a shaft that was about 1 to 1.3 meters to the actual ceiling of the apartment block below. Now, the work that was being done was some basic maintenance work, but there was a failure to identify the hazard that existed with the presence of those skylights. And when you look at the next photograph, you'll see what that hazard actually was. Now, the worker that was injured in this particular incident, he had no recollection as a result of his injuries how he came to fall through the skylight, but nonetheless, as I said, it was about a 1 to 1.3 metre shaft that led to an apartment below, which we've got a photograph which also depicts that. and that was a fairly high ceiling and a fall onto a marble floor. So in this instance, the risk associated with working on the roof and the fact that you've only got a thin sheet of polycarbonate that protects a person potentially from basically a 4.5 metre fall, that wasn't identified. And as a result, we had a worker who was in his mid-20s who'd just been married. He suffered a fairly catastrophic spinal injury, which has resulted in him not being able to walk again. A significant head injury. He was a young Irish fellow, and he decided after this incident that he basically wanted a fresh start, and saw fit to return home to Ireland after the incident. So in relation to that particular matter, we charged the company that had management and control of the activities with failing to provide a safe workplace by not identifying the hazard and risk associated with a fall from heights, albeit that I suppose on initial assessment of the scene, you wouldn't have considered that there was a risk of somebody falling essentially from what was essentially a floor, some 4.5 metres to an internal floor below.
A couple of interesting points. Actually, we talked about this as a case study in prosecutions, and in this particular case, we didn't proceed forward with that. But the impact, both on the worker, we understand, but for the employer themselves, was there a better outcome following this, even though there wasn't necessarily a prosecution?
Look, I think we achieved a number of things as a result of our investigation. Obviously, we provided some comfort to the injured worker to know that his employer was held accountable, and the end result was, whilst the matter didn't go all the way through to court, because one of the things that we have to do at all times is take into account what's best for the victim. In this instance, the young worker, as I said, he wanted to put it all behind him and didn't want to testify, wanted to basically get on with his life. But nonetheless, the company was subject to a rigorous investigation. They were made well and truly aware of where they'd fallen short in relation to their processes, and the impact of an investigation in itself, irrespective of the outcome, is always significant to a duty holder, because it does place all of their systems under scrutiny, and it ends up being a fairly stressful process. And as a result of that, we had a company that was able to revise their systems of work, and were better placed to identify the hazards when doing this type of work.
Thank you. It struck me in looking at the picture, even from my point of view, is just, and you used the word on face value. On face value, it looked kind of innocuous. And it's important there about the preparing and understanding the hazards that are before you, and particularly in a construction environment that could be quite dynamic by its very nature. The aspect of protecting the worker against that, it kind of leads into your second story about guarding. So having a physical barrier or guard to protect, in that particular case, against the skylight. Now, we know there's obligations on employers to ensure that they provide physical barriers or appropriate guarding that prevents moving body parts becoming in contact with moving parts. And that's an obligation that is very clear with employers to ensure that that occurs. Because as we know, I think it's one of the state's biggest safety issues is guarding and interactions with plant. A long way around to the question of saying, I believe you have a story from 2019 where an employee's hand and forearm got entangled in a bottling machine used to make cordial. Can you walk us through that? What happened and what was the outcome?
Yeah, this was, I suppose, what we'd call one of our sort of bread and butter investigations, these basic unguarded plant investigations. And quite often, as with the last example that we just showed, the hazard won't be immediately obvious, but sometimes it's actually patently obvious, and we get quite surprised that nobody's been able to pick up and proactively address issues when certain items of plant are enter the workplace. And in this particular instance, as you say, it was a bottling plant, a company that bottled fruit juices and cordials, and they purchased a a machine which automated the bottling process, and you'll see the from the photograph. There's quite a lot of exposed componentry. There are a lot of in-running nip points, and in this particular instance, there was a rotating part within the body of the machine that was referred to as a change plate. It was a type of cam, and the gaps in the plate were designed to manage a certain shape of bottle. And in this particular occasion, the workplace were using a round bottle, but the can was designed to deal with rectangular shaped bottles. Now, the upshot of that was that as the bottles moved through, because of this poor fit, they would often tip over, and the employees were just naturally inclined to want to reach in and pick the bottles up. And we had a supervisor who was constantly warning them, so he's obviously well and truly aware of the hazards that were present in relation to this machine. He was constantly warning them, don't put your hands in there, just leave the bottles alone. And as quite often happens, we were getting towards the end of a long day and they were waiting to finish up. And on this particular occasion, the supervisor went against his own advice, and probably more accurately described by the next photograph, he decided to reach in to basically quickly whip his hand in, stand a bottle up, and pull his hand out, but he wasn't quick enough. And in this particular instance, like I said, every component within this particular machine was unguarded. Now, anyone who works with any sort of plant should know that if there's an opportunity for an item of plant to turn or to crush, to chop, to bend, there's always going to be a risk for entrapment and damage to a part of a person's body. And it's obviously a duty that when you bring these sort of pieces of plant into a workplace, that you make the appropriate assessment and see that it meets the standards for guarding. And in this instance, there was essentially no guarding whatsoever, none at all. And there were at least a dozen points within that particular piece of plant that could have resulted in someone getting a finger, a hand, or an arm caught within, one part of the bottling process. So, in relation to this particular matter, notices were obviously put on the employer to improve the safety of the machine. The whole machine was encased in essentially in a cage with an interlock system that, of course, disabled the machine if anyone tried to get beyond that guarding. Now, this particular company was charged with failing to have a safe workplace in that it had unguarded plant, and we ended up with a penalty in excess of $100,000. And in relation to that particular penalty, it was fairly catastrophic for the company, and they were no longer able to trade after that. So.
And I was going to ask there, when you made the comment that there was actually no guards whatsoever, because one of the things we tend to hear is the guard was over in the corner. It had been removed. In this case, it wasn't. But then you went on to say that there was a physical barrier with an interlock, and that was also disabled. Did they explain why they disabled it?
They later on introduced a full guarding and with interlock as a means of control. And essentially with this, I think we were talking about a company that was struggling a little bit and made the decision to operate that particular piece of plant with, I suppose, on the hopes that nobody would be hurt, that there would be no incidents, and the cost that would have been associated with actually applying that guarding really was minuscule compared to the ultimate penalty that the company was subjected to. So it's that it's that consideration that when you're talking in terms of the financial constraints around this sort of stuff, what's the health and safety of one of your workers worth, and what are the potential penalties as opposed to simply providing a safe workplace in the first instance.
It's interesting you're talking about providing a safe workplace in the first instance from a point of view of we talk about a prosecution and there's an outcome of guilt, or there's a cost associated with. Can you give us a little bit of an insight into the background of the effort that's involved, not so much necessarily from WorkSafe's point of view, but your view of an employer defending a charge? How much time does that take?
Well, it's quite time consuming. I think the biggest burden that's always suffered from anyone that's placed in this sort of position is really the psychological, the emotional burden that goes along with it. Obviously, dealing with lawyers, most people don't associate with lawyers on a regular basis. So when you have a lawyer enter the workplace, there seems to be, whilst there's I suppose, an element of support that the people responsible might feel, there's also a strain and an awareness of the potential penalties, and that flows on down to the workers as well. And then you've got the situation where, whilst we don't mean to cause any distress to any person, we're entering the workplace usually fairly regularly after an incident. We're speaking with people, and then there's that natural reticence, I suppose, for people to become involved in these sort of processes, to be questioned, to have formal statements taken from them. So the whole process is fairly onerous on all involved. And, if there are charges laid, then that ramps the whole process up again, once people start having to go through the court system. So it's not an environment that I'd think anyone would ever wish to find themselves in, Rob.
And it's interesting, the previous session we spoke about not just the physical injuries, but in many ways the hidden impacts, or the ripple effect. And that's part of it. And prevention first, I suppose, is where we're at. So trying to get ahead of the game or get ahead of the risks or hazards has become so much more important, because of ultimately, yes, there'll be a court case and there may be a fine with it, but it's that ripple effect that occurs. And in this case, as you said, the business didn't survive. No,
and it goes far beyond the business itself. When we talk about the friends, the relatives, that the immediate family of people that get hurt. And then, if you're a business owner and you are placed under the stress with the prospect of a prosecution, well, then the impact that has on families. So as you say, the ripple effect is far reaching. And of course, when you have injured workers, or indeed workers that die, well, the impacts of that, it goes on for years. And
you talked there about the impact on families. I think the next one we talk about involves families. And this is a farming incident. And we know, again, by its very nature, farming can be quite dynamic. There's a lot happening on a farm, whether you're the producer or providing the service to them. So there's hazards around you. And some of the more major or common hazards you'd have is dealing with livestock. Large livestock can be a big part of that, but also the area of moving plant. So whether it's quad bikes, which we know have been well represented or overrepresented in fatalities, tractors or front-end loaders, and their entanglement with attachments becomes really, really important. You have a story to tell us about a front-end loader. Can you share that with us?
Yes, well, again, this is one of I suppose, our more sort of bread and butter type scenarios, but one that had a terrible outcome in that it resulted in the death of a worker. And as you say, the farming environment poses any number of hazards, and really provides us with a great deal of our work, especially at this time of year. I must mention, when it comes into the harvesting sort of season, we really find that we're doing a lot of work in the rural sector. On this particular occasion, it was a bit of a confusing job to start with, and in the first photograph that I've presented here, you sort of see the scene. I suppose the main part of the scene from a little bit of a distance, in that we've got a front end loader that's over near a shed in the background, and it's come to rest. It collided with a forklift and was surrounded by gas tanks and fuel drums and all that sort of stuff over there. And this was a really poorly maintained farm. It was an egg farm, so we had a lot of chickens running around, and there were also hundreds of metres of a combination of sort of industrial and domestic power cords that were running from sheds to other sheds, running through puddles of water and so forth. And now our deceased was sort of located basically in the foreground of this photograph. And initially we thought he might have been he might have been electrocuted. But it took us a little while to sort of work out what had actually gone on. And part of what assisted us was you might see sort of in the right-hand part of that photograph is a gouge mark, and that was actually caused by the auger on the back of the front end loader dragging on the ground. We're able to trace that back a couple of 100 metres, and the deceased on this particular occasion had been working on this farm on a bit of an ad hoc basis with his son, who was the primary contractor, and he went along and helped out. And the front end loader had been parked a few 100 metres away. And what we worked out in the course of our investigation, and I think in the next photograph you'll get a bit more of an idea of the plant itself. It was in very, very poor condition, and we discovered that the only way you could actually start this particular machine was by you'd have to stand on the chassis rail on the side of the machine, connect the terminal to the battery, and when that occurred, the starter motor was seized in the on position. So the moment you connected the terminal to the battery, the machine fired up, and on this occasion it had been left in gear. So the moment our worker started up the machine, it actually took off, and he held on to the side of the machine for several hundred metres, a couple of 100 metres, and obviously had to make the decision whether he was going to remain on the side of the machine and ultimately ride it into the forklift and the gas bottles and the fuel drums and so forth. So he made the decision to jump clear, and unfortunately went under the rear wheel of the front end loader and sustained fatal crush injuries. So we had a forensic engineer attend to inspect the item of plant. The next photo will give you a bit more of an indication of what the workers on this particular workplace were made to endure when doing their work and operating this particular piece of plant. The seat was, the upholstery was gone. There was no seat belt. The doors didn't work. The access to the cabin was via climbing through the broken windows. The brakes were inoperative. The hydraulics were leaking. All the connections were loose and sloppy. And as I said a little bit earlier, the only way you could start it was by actually standing alongside the plant and connecting the terminal to the battery. So, and I suppose one of the things that I find strange with doing this sort of work in dealing with the director, who was actually a nice young fella. It was a family concern. They were starting this business up. They were short of cash and really didn't probably have a great knowledge in relation to what was required around maintaining and having a plant in a condition that was safe to use by the employees. So there was no intent to cause anyone any harm, but there was a real negligence, I suppose, associated with their knowledge around the type of machinery that they were employing at their workplace. And as a result, we charged this particular company with failing to maintain plant, not having a safe workplace, and that the plant was unsafe, and ended up being again a fine well in excess of $100,000 for that particular company. And as I said, the deceased, he was working at that particular place with his son. His son turned up to the scene not long after the incident occurred, so he was forced to deal with the spectre of his father lying deceased there on the farm. And again, the impact to the director and his sister, who was the co-director of the company, and the other workers out there was significant. The deceased partner, I had quite a bit to do with her in over the next 12 months until the matter went to court, and received phone calls from her quite regularly in a very distressed sort of state. So obviously there's the pecuniary penalty that's applied to the company, but then that ongoing emotional, psychological penalty that's inflicted upon everyone in the surrounds. Again, we talk about that ripple effect. Well, I've got no doubt that's ongoing.
Thanks for that. I'm mindful there's a fatality here, and I'm sensitive to that circumstance, but it's stunning to see the condition inside that cab. And to many people, they'll be stunned to see that. do we understand why they thought that was okay? And the flip side of that is about saying, and we spoke about service providers coming in on site as well as inspectors, if you see stuff like that, what can you do?
Well, I think there's that, and when you look through the OHS Act, there's obligations on people at all levels through a workplace, from the employees themselves right up to the directors. And there has to be an obligation on everyone that when you see something that you know is not right to speak up. In that particular instance, we had a fellow who'd worked around heavy machinery, was a diesel mechanic. He well and truly knew what was right and what was wrong. But then there's that, which we quite often find with older workers, there's that level of complacency, there's that level of acceptance and a reliance perhaps upon experience, where their really better judgment should say that they should really just stop, think about what they're doing, and make the changes necessary to make their workplaces safer. And in the case of the director, the first questions I asked him were around, what's your preventative maintenance schedule? Who does your serving and maintenance? And that was really a foreign concept to him. It was all about producing eggs, which he obviously had some knowledge of, but in relation to using that sort of equipment, which was using to construct other sheds, he had no idea. So his failure to sort of really delve into to some more of the details associated with the type of activities he was undertaking was ultimately disastrous.
Thank you. We spoke about earlier on is that ripple effect, and each one of those cases we've looked at have been devastating for the worker, for their family, and for the business itself. And I mentioned the fact that you've probably seen more incidents and fatalities than most in WorkSafe. Is there a common theme, and whether it's across sectors or industries, is there a common theme or themes you'd want us to understand or remember?
Look, I think one of the things that surprises me, throughout my career doing this sort of work, is the simplicity associated with so many of these instances. There's, as we've seen with these three case studies, unguarded, unsafe plant, a fairly obvious people to, in doing the sort of trades associated with construction as to where fall hazards might present themselves. And the combination of either workers that have been doing their job a very long time and who you would think would well and truly possess the requisite knowledge to ensure their own safety at work, or else younger workers who who are often just in the first months in those sort of fledgling periods of their time as employees. They're probably the most consistent things I see. There's very, very few matters that take a lot of figuring out where you sort of get taken aback and say, geez, I could never have foreseen that occurring. They're always really related to fairly simple mistakes, really, and mistakes that shouldn't have been allowed to occur.
We spoke about this a bit earlier on in some of the other webinars we've done this year as well, is about complacency. And there's no place for complacency in say, workplace safety. Is that a factor at times in there?
Well, it is, as I said, especially when we talk about the older workers who hurt themselves doing something that they've done probably every day for 20 years, or when plant does deteriorate, when you have those, the small faults that are then fixed, as we see occasionally, with a bit of gaffer tape or a bit of baling twine, like the complacency that comes with accepting a piece of plant slowly starting to degrade, and as opposed to taking it back to the provider and having it restored to its original operating condition, instead just going on making sort of ad hoc repairs as you go, and allowing plant to fall into disrepair. So complacency is a big issue.
Thanks for sharing those three case studies. It's time to go to questions. So when you're ready, I got some questions coming through on Slido here. So you'll see me looking off to the side to grab the questions. And the first one's an interesting one. It's a question that's received the most likes as well. And it's actually about our own inspectors. Some events must be hard for inspectors. how do you look after your people that attend the sites and have to cope with what they say? What support is there for them?
Well, we've got quite a lot of support. Like myself, I'm part of a crew of 10 that do the fatalities, and obviously we interact with the inspectors that are responsible for the areas where incidents occur. With I think probably the most pleasing thing, and it's a fairly informal way of dealing with the trauma and the issues associated with attending to serious injuries and fatalities. It really is just that peer support and the camaraderie. Very fortunate that all the guys that we work with are dedicated to their task, and we're all well and truly aware of the impact that these things sort of have upon us. So having that close association, the ability to talk and debrief, not so much in the office now, of course, with COVID, but still, through the medium that we're communicating with at the moment, and having that sort of constant contact, which is a requirement in the aftermath of any incident, because obviously there's a lot of paperwork, a lot of notes, statement taking, and that sort of stuff. So you develop a strong rapport when you work with people under the sort of pressure situations that we find ourselves in when we go to these sort of scenes. On top of that, obviously, WorkSafe try to be the leader in terms of how workers are supported, especially in the aftermath of serious incidents. So we've got good providers in terms of helping us deal with these sort of instances, and our managers are all well aware. So the support structure is really strong, both internally and externally. So I myself, like, obviously, after I try to go to as many of these instances as I can, and in the aftermath, I spend a lot of time with the guys. We've worked together for a long time. We know each other well. So I try to stay fairly in tune with the keys that the cues that indicate when one of the guys isn't perhaps coping as well as he should have. But they're a pretty resilient bunch by and large.
Thank you, and it just reminds me again of we've mentioned it in the previous webinar about the hidden impacts. And while we're not directly related in the fatality or the serious incident itself, it's our staff. So I know it's an anonymous question, but to that person, thank you very much for asking that question and showing concern for our staff, because these are the hidden impacts or the ripple effects in dealing with these incidents that we want to prevent. Next question up, and this is in relation to the skylight. So did the building owner have an opportunity, did the building owner have any responsibility regarding communication this hazard to the maintenance company?
I suppose you're talking in terms of the body corporate. I can't recall the specifics there. The apartment into which he fell was actually owned by an old lady, and it was actually I can't recall, and I'm sorry that, because it is a little bit of an historic matter. They were actually working in a services tower that was adjacent to where the fall occurred. But ultimately, we scoped our investigation in relation to the overarching entity, the employer of the injured worker, because there should have really been an assessment on that in that area to identify the hazards in the first instance and identify that potential fall hazard.
Thank you. The next one up is, does the manufacturer bear some responsibility for appropriate guarding?
Any piece of plant, there's a couple of sections within the Act that talk about the obligations of people who manufacture, supply, install, commission pieces of plant. So each one of those has sort of got to be looked in terms of its individual circumstances. So in relation to the bottling machine, there was actually we did try to explore that aspect, but it was bought from second hand from a very old gentleman in a bit of a I suppose not a very formal sort of process, and there weren't actually any identifying markings on that particular piece of plant. We assumed it was actually a fairly historic piece of plant, and were unable to even identify who the manufacturer was. But by and large, yep, certainly if you supply or install or manufacture any sort of plant, you need to provide information to the people that are ultimately going to use it to ensure they're able to use it and install it and so forth in a safe manner.
If they wanted to find more information, they could be able to find that on our website as well.
Yep. On the website or via inspectors directly.
Thank you. The next one again is still with the skylight. Did the company he worked for have a SWIMS pre-start and site-specific risk assessment before he commenced work?
There was quite a considerable amount of the appropriate paperwork that in relation to the job, but the issue was primarily the failure to identify the presence of the skylights as a risk. Does that
go towards, I suppose, I mentioned earlier on about the dynamic nature of some of this work, that you have to be looking for, hunting down those type of hazards to make sure you got them addressed. And it becomes, whether it's, you can't use ignorance as an excuse, but it's that thinking ahead, anticipating what could go wrong.
Yeah, and a little bit, we find it a lot, I suppose, with working at heights too, where you essentially have a generic safe work method statement, which doesn't take into account changing conditions. We see it all the time, especially in relation to things like solar installation, where you'll see that the safe work method statement really is fairly generic, and all of a sudden you find, hang on, these guys are working on an old church that's now a resident, and you've got a high-pitched roof, or there's trees that are overhanging, or there's no provisions for handrailing to be installed or something like that, and the failure to adapt a safe work method statement, the failure to sit and think and talk and map out some sort of system where you can carry out your work safely. That's a fairly common theme. So just again, when you mentioned before about complacency, that it's just the same sort of work, just a different location, but there are subtle differences within certain locations that present unique types of hazards.
Thank you. I'm actually going to take this opportunity to promote a session tomorrow, and that's it is about construction. And as I said earlier, it's dynamic, and construction sites of all types are changing, and with that, the hazards and risks change. So tomorrow morning, we'll be actually exploring topics like working at heights, electrical issues, and inadequate safety plans. That session's on tomorrow at 8 to 8:45, and it's called 3 Ways to Save Your Livelihood and Mates on Site Today. So that's a good opportunity. I think we've mentioned it a few times now, so I think it's a good opportunity to promote that one. So we'll go to the next question. In relation to falls from heights incidents, if this was an apprentice that is employed by a group training organization but hosted to another employer, what are the expectations of the group training organization to manage the risk if they do not have control of the site or activity?
Well, anyone who's got any sort of management and control responsibility for an employee's got an obligation to ensure that the type of work that they're doing is properly monitored, and that the people that are engaged with the activity of all the risks have been assessed. Now, when we're talking in terms there, I'm not sure with the question, are we talking in terms of like labour hire, or are we talking in terms of like the training groups that oversee sort of apprentice training? I'm not sure what that's actually referred. Certainly in relation to, if they're coming through a labour hire company, and this is something we deal with all the time, and it's a real bugbear. Obviously, when people are supplied through labour hire companies, the labour hire company should be making sure that they know exactly what these workers are being provided for, exactly what hazards they're going to be exposed to, and that all the appropriate mitigation is put in place.
And it goes towards the previous session, the term support and communication, I think, becomes really important there. That if you're just blindly sending somebody out to a site that you don't know about, that's not appropriate, it's not adequate, and it's not acceptable. It's about that communication with the host place or the host employer, and understanding, as you just said, is what they're being exposed to. So they will have a duty of sorts, but it's about them making the inquiries about who is this, who are they going to, and what are they going to be doing. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
and it all comes down to, I suppose, when you're putting someone, if you've got management and control of someone, if you're putting someone into a position where they're potentially at risk, well, you need to have a look at what your obligations are, and it's a little bit difficult to answer that question, because obviously scenarios change, and very 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 few incidents are exactly alike, but I think you've got to assess each one on its merit.
Thank you. Next one's a good question. It's about learning. And the theme this year is about you learn something new every day. And the question's about us. How is WorkSafe using incident investigation learnings to reduce potential for harm in similar workplaces?
Oh, we do that in a number of ways. Obviously, there's the communication that we have with the inspectorate and the ability of us to contribute towards prevention files, which go towards, targeted visits through industries, industry alerts, all that sort of stuff.
Can I add a little bit to that as well?
Yes.
As you said, it's the learning aspect, and within WorkSafe, whether it's through our guidance material area, whether we get a quick alert out, whether we design actual programs, and those in this particular case, let's talk about construction. Falls from heights is a big thing, so the inspectors will have specific projects to deal with there, and then through engagement, through working or our key stakeholders, making sure that they're educated or informed about the particular risk. So I think, as you said, there's a suite of ways we try and communicate with the industry to raise the awareness of those particular type of hazards. Again, is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, no, 100%. And it goes back to some of those earlier questions, like when we discover that there's a piece of plant that's inherently unsafe, or if there's a newly identified hazard that's present within a specific industry. Well, that's really our bread and butter. And at the end of the day, we're all about prevention. Like my role is the worst aspect of WorkSafe, in that we're very reactive, and that we're really there to look at the worst case scenarios. But I think we're the investigators and obviously the inspectors are all about prevention. And whenever we identify anything, it's our number one priority to sort of get that message out there that, hey, here's a new hazard, or here's a better way of doing your job.
Thanks. Noticing the time, so I'll try and get through a few more. Is there ever a situation where a workplace fatality isn't investigated?
I'd say no. Now, this is there are levels of investigation. Like a full comprehensive investigation, obviously, is quite it's quite wide-reaching, but there are occasions, and I suppose the classic example is we have these, unfortunately, all too frequently, where you have a sole trader, say a farmer who rolls his tractor or his quad bike. Obviously, we contribute to the coronial inquiry, and we'll ascertain if there are any other duty holders, if there was anyone that owed a duty to the deceased. But in the case where it's basically a sole trader, well, then we're required to do very, very little work.
Thank you. There's one question I want to get in, because I can see the words or the letters HSR, and I think that's an important thing to continue to promote. In the case of the skylight, actually in either cases, were there any HSRs or other OH&S monitors at the workplace with no guarding? So I think we can take that for both, whether it's a skylight or the operating machine.
In relation to the guarding example, it was a fairly basic sort of workplace. It wasn't a large workforce, and one of those sort of, I suppose, one of those workplaces that sort of run on the smell of an oily rag, I suppose. So there wasn't a great deal of sophistication in relation to the management of it. And to be honest, in relation to the skylight one, it's a little bit of an historic matter, and I can't recall.
No worries. Thanks. And Phil, thanks for that question, because it does raise the point, the awareness, the use of HSRs and the value that they provide as eyes and ears and another support mechanism in many ways. They do have their functions and powers as well, but it's also having a HSR on site can add so much more to your safety, performance and behaviours on site. So thanks for that question, Phil. We're just about out of time. So one of the last questions I'll ask is, what psychological considerations do WorkSafe investigators make or consider when investigating a workplace incident?
Well, I think and I hope I interpret this question correctly, there's a real balancing act when we attend a scene, because obviously one of our key duties is to try and establish facts in I suppose, a formally recorded manner as quickly and as promptly as we can. And one of the real concerns we have is that if we don't do that, there's a certain amount of, I suppose, contamination that goes on between witnesses and people at a workplace, and they have an impact on everyone else's recollection of what occurs. So we have to, I suppose most significantly, we have to balance our desire to do a thorough investigation as promptly as we can with the condition of the people that we're dealing with, because some people are fairly stoic and are able to accept what has occurred and move on fairly quickly. Others, when we talk about that ripple effect, others do not recover. And I can think of many occasions where people have been subject to these types of instances and have never gone back to work. So we have to be very mindful at the end of the day of the impact that we actually have on people that we deal with when we conduct the investigations. And it's a real, to be honest, it's a real tightrope we have to walk in terms of doing our job and looking after the people that we deal with.
Thank you. Well, that's basically a wrap. That's as many questions as we can get through. So what I'd like to do now is just thank Mark Lannister. Mark, thank you very much for sharing your profiles of prosecutions today.
No, you're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Well, we hope you found that interesting and informative. And really the point is we hope that those stories don't happen to you. If you saw the earlier session today, that's exactly what the purpose is, and it goes to why WorkSafe exists. And again, I think we've answered that. That's to reduce workplace harm. In this case, it is very much about reducing workplace harm. You would have heard the term ripple effect a lot. That's something to be really mindful of, is that it's those hidden impacts of the ripple effect from these type of cases that they last a long time. So if this raises any concerns for you today, please contact WorkSafe's either advisory line or emergency line. If you'd like to get some more information about what we spoke about today, again, I encourage you to get in touch with us. Now, shortly, you'll see on the screen information that were contained in today's session. If you want them, they'll be available as well. So on behalf of myself, Mark, and WorkSafe, I'd like to thank you for joining us today.